going to kind of move on, to your other recent article about the kind of counteroffensive specifically and its kind of slow progression. Can you just tell me a bit more about that article and the writing of that?
Sure. Yeah. So I joined the Ares Battalion of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, which is a kind of volunteer corps part of the regular army, as they were storming the village of Staromayorsk in Zaporizhia region, southern Ukraine. This is part of the main counteroffensive. And it was a really kind of grinding artillery first, pounding the village. It's a very small village, less than 1,000 people were living there before the war. Most of them are now evacuated, if not all. And it was a demonstration that, for all the kind of Western provided tanks and armor that have been helping Ukraine, if Ukraine doesn't have the kind of long range rockets and air power, it's going to find it very difficult to drive the Russians out of very heavily fortified, pre-prepared positions. So it couldn't really use Western armor in these villages because the villages have such narrow streets and they become vulnerable to infantry using anti-tank weapons. And so after a kind of initial barrage of artillery that kind of flattened a lot of houses, the Ares Battalion went in to try and take these cottages, and it's house-to-house fighting. The Russians had learned from previous villages that the Ukrainians had cleared that the Ukrainians would come in and throw grenades in the cottages and throw grenades in the basements. And so instead of staying there, they had dug trenches quite deep into kind of gardens, animal enclosures, vegetable patches, and were hiding. And so when the Ukrainians come in, the Russians would emerge from just 20 meters away and open fire at them. So it was really close combat there, really grueling stuff. But the Ukrainians, while I was there, managed to prevail and actually raise the flag over Staromayorsk. So it was a much needed victory for them after weeks of a grinding counteroffensive.
What did you learn about the reasons of why it's potentially moving slowly?
Yeah, there's been a lot of analysis about why it's taking so long for the Ukrainians to make serious ground in this region. I mean, firstly, obviously, the Russians are incredibly well dug in. They've been dug in there for months. They've got concrete fortifications. They've got very, very heavy minefields to get through. And Ukraine has engineering equipment from the West, but it probably doesn't have enough to deal with the amount of mines that it has to clear. But I think that the main thing, there have been other reasons given about there being a lot of rain and it being harder to traverse terrain and a lot of green foliage as a result that does hide and obscure Russian positions. But that also serves to obscure Ukrainians as they advance and where they put their armored vehicles when they're not advancing. But really, the key thing here is the lack of air power. And so the West has been delaying and delaying and delaying, providing Ukraine with air power. And you really, if you're going to put tanks into combat, they need to have air power over them. They need aerial superiority to make sure that Russian attack helicopters aren't engaging, which is happening at the moment. And it also needs more long-range missiles to engage supply depots and logistic hubs. And the UK has provided Storm Shadow missiles, and France has provided their equivalent of that, which are now starting to strike very deep behind Russian lines and obviously having an impact. But for some reason, the US is really reluctant to provide its ATACMS missiles, which have a range of 300 kilometers and could make a huge difference. They're launched from the HIMARS missile launchers that the US has already provided.
Why do you think they're being reluctant to provide those to the war effort?
It's a great mystery at this point because the original reasoning was that it might be escalation, it might anger the Russians, but we've seen a lot of Russian red lines have already been crossed with no more escalation than is already happening in Ukraine. The US said that they were worried that Ukraine would use some of these missiles to strike Russian territory. Ukraine has been very careful not to use its HIMARS missiles against Russian territory, and it's also using Storm Shadow only when specifically agreed with the UK. So the delays are incredibly frustrating for Ukrainian officials and difficult to understand from the outside at this point.
You mentioned like the terrain. That's what I've been reading about. UK intelligence said that it was overgrown foliage, kind of blocking Russians from view. I wonder how much of that do you potentially think is the West kind of covering their backs for not necessarily providing Ukraine with the things that they need to therefore be as fast as everyone kind of wants them to be in the counteroffensive?
Yeah, I mean, foliage does play a role in obscuring positions, but it's not the crucial factor in this. The crucial factor is definitely lack of air power, and I think perhaps British intelligence is covering slightly for the fact that the US have been so reluctant to provide that, and there has been some tensions between the US and the UK because the UK Defence Minister has been more forthcoming in trying to get support for Ukraine and provide Ukraine with more weapons and more capabilities than it had, whereas the US has been rather a lot slower. And there have been reports that there are some tensions between the US and the UK as a result of that. So maybe we're now doing a favor to the US by saying, look, there are all these other reasons why the counteroffensive might be going slowly, but really long range missiles and air power would make all the difference here.
I know you can't predict the future, but obviously, of your experience of kind of being there and being immersed, what do you kind of think for the near future, how things are kind of going to play out?
I think it depends enormously on the West's role and whether the West is prepared to understand that it is involved in some way in a war that has an important role to play here. Ukraine has used up much of its kind of Soviet era stockpiled weapons. It's now very heavily dependent on Western ammunition, and our economies simply aren't geared for a war economy. We're not producing a huge amount of ammunition. We're not producing a huge amount of missiles. I mean, for instance, the kind of in America they produce about 150 Patriot missiles a year, and Ukraine will use those in a month defending Kiev from Russian air attacks. So unless the West is prepared to really ratchet up its armament supplies and its manufacturing and actually start to put itself on the same kind of war footing that Russia is, it's going to be really slow going for Ukraine. It's going to be really difficult because they just don't have. They've got the will to fight and they've got the people who will fight, but they don't have the equipment they need to retake the land.
Do you think the West will kind of do that?
Well, the West has been talking about it, and it's a question of politics. I think what are people's priorities when you have a difficult economic situation at home, and you're perhaps facing elections in the next few years. Do you focus on trying to placate people at home, or kind of face down this kind of broader threat to the values of your civilization? So I think it's a tough choice for politicians. It's easier, of course, to look at the domestic issues and think that's where the focus has got to be because that's where we win votes. But on the other hand, if you allow the kind of values that Ukraine is fighting for to fail, and the values that Russia is embodying at the moment with through its war crimes and its complete disregard for international law, what kind of world will we be living in after that?